Welcome to the C-Suite series presented by Channel Check and Noble Capital Markets. Noble's an SEC-registered, FINRA-licensed broker-dealer and the source of the equity research available on Channel Check. Today's interview features Eledon Pharmaceuticals, NASDAQ ticker symbol ELDN. Noble Senior Research Analyst Robert LeBoyer interviews Eledon Pharmaceuticals CEO D.A. Gros. Visit channelcheck.com or click the link in the description to access equity research, news, and advanced market data on Eledon Pharmaceuticals, all at no cost. And now, here's Robert and DA.
I'm Robert LeBoyer, Senior Biotechnology Analyst at Noble Capital. With me here today is Dr. David-Alexandre Gros, CEO of Eledon Pharmaceuticals. Eledon is a company focused on immunology, specifically the reaction between the CD40 and CD40 ligand and its stimulation of an immune response. The lead drug in development, tegoprubart, is in clinical trials to prevent kidney transplant rejection and is also in development for autoimmune diseases and xenotransplantation, the transplantation of an organ from one species into a different species. Dr. Gros is the CEO of Eledon, having come through medical training as an MD and then spending time in industry with some of the leaders in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. So here to tell us about the CD40 ligand science and the clinical trials and strategy for the company is Dr. Gros. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about CD40 and the science underlying tegoprubart?
Sure, and thank you very much for inviting me, Robert. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. When we talk, I will be making some forward-looking statements, so I do encourage anyone looking at our conversation to please check our disclaimers and public disclosures on the topic. You asked about the role of CD40 ligand in immunology, and it's the following. It is a very central role in how the immune system works. So as we all know, the core of our immune system are white blood cells. And these white blood cells come in three different types, roughly. There are white blood cells such as macrophages or dendritic cells that fall under a category called antigen-presenting cells. Those are cells that go around the body and find proteins to analyze and to check whether those proteins are self or foreign. There are T cells, which play the central role in the immune system in that they interact with other types of cells and tell the cells whether they are looking at a signal that is self, so that does not need an immune response, or foreign, in which case the immune response needs to be activated. And the third type of a cell is a B cell. And B cells are the cells that produce antibodies. So when they're told by the T cells that there is a foreign protein, those B cells will create antibodies to go find and target that protein, almost like arrows. The role of anti-CD40 ligand is in how the T cells talk to either the antigen-presenting cells or the B cells. The way the immune system gets turned on when it finds a signal that there is an invasion, that there is something foreign in the body, is by the T cells shaking the hands, if you will. It's called co-stimulation with with antigen-presenting cells, seeing the foreign protein and then activating. And when the T cells activate, they can become one of two types of T cells. The first type is called a helper T cell, and the helper T cell once it's activated, it will go on to activate the B cells to launch the antibodies or to activate the antigen presenting cells and to tell them, be on the lookout for this protein. The second thing that the T cells can do when they get activated is to become something called a killer T cell. And the name says it all. They then go on the hunt for that protein in order to recognize what is foreign and destroy it. So the first role of anti-CD40 ligand is in how these T cells communicate with B cells or antigen presenting cells and allowing the immune system to get activated. Interestingly, when the T cells are interacting with antigen presenting cells, they look at the protein and they see the signal as not being foreign, so not needing an immune response, then the T cells can become something called a T regulatory cell. And these are the type of cells that are the brakes of the immune system and tone down the immune system. So our molecule works by making it harder for antigen presenting cells to talk to T cells and for the T cells to talk to the B cells. And in that way, they inhibit the T cells from activating, from becoming helper T cells or killer T cells. And thus, it's taking the foot off the gas, if you will, in the immune system. We change how they talk so that the T cells do not turn on the immune system. By doing that, the T cells also can become T regulatory cells, and so tell the rest of the immune system to tone down. And as such, it's like putting the brake on the immune system. Now, this is very different than the way immunomodulators have historically worked. In the past, most historical drugs have targeted a type of white blood cells and almost like a targeted poison try to wipe out that immune cell population. With the idea being, if we wipe out a class of white blood cells, then those white blood cells are less likely to cause an autoimmune disorder or to mount, because they can't mount an attack since they're no longer there. But that can cause what is called lymphopenia or white blood cell count. Our approach is much more targeted, much more modern. It's a 2030s approach, if you will, to immunomodulation, so to modulating the immune system. And this targeted approach allows us, as I mentioned, to both take the foot off the gas of the immune system, so prevent the immune system from activating, as well as put the foot on the brake of the immune system, so downregulate the immune system. So at a high level, that's how we work.
Great. That idea of shifting the balance away from stimulation and towards suppression sums it up very nicely. So how are you applying this principle to clinical trials and diseases?
We are applying this in a targeted manner, looking at our first indications, and in particular in transplant medicine. Now, if you think about how broad an effect this could have to stop the activation of an immune system and step on the brake of the immune system in parallel, that could be used for many, many different immunological-based disorders. We've chosen to focus on transplant medicine, although we do have a program in ALS as well. And the ALS research is really the history and the DNA of our company. The reason why we've decided to focus on transplant in that in many ways, it's the low-hanging fruit for this type of a mechanism. In animal models, so whether it's using rats or dogs or in particular monkeys, this mechanism of anti-CD40 ligand has shown some of the best, if not the best efficacy in protecting transplanted organs and allowing them to function.
Great. And you mentioned the idea of wiping out populations of T cells. Can you discuss the standard of care in kidney transplantation and how tegoprubart would compare with what's being done clinically today?
Sure. So the current standard of care is the use of a type of a drug called a calcineurin inhibitor. The lead calcineurin inhibitor being used is a drug called tacrolimus. Now, tacrolimus made modern transplantation medicine possible. It was approved in 1994. So as I was going through my scientific and medical training, and when it came out, it revolutionized transplant medicine. In particular, what tacrolimus did very well was, for the first time, it allowed the vast majority of organs that we were transplanting to survive 1 year. Most of transplants in the United States are kidney transplants. We do over 25,000 kidney transplants a year in the US. And when tacrolimus came out, it allowed 90% of these kidney transplants to make it a year. The problem became over the long term. So today, the average transplanted kidney only works for about 10 years or just over 10 years after it's been transplanted. But the average age at transplantation is only 50. So that means that people that are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, in order to live a normal lifespan, are likely to need 2, 3, or even more kidney transplants. But as we all know, there aren't enough organs. So I mentioned of the 20, we do 25,000 kidney transplants a year in the US, but at the same time, we have 5,000 Americans that die each year waiting for a kidney that does not become available for them.
Yes.
Now, on the waiting list of 90,000 people, 15,000 of those people waiting for kidneys have already had one or multiple transplants. So the need is to reduce the need for repeat transplants by allowing kidneys ideally to function longer. Since the longer a kidney would function, the less requirements would be for repeat transplants. And our mission at Eledon is one transplant for life. So we are hoping to keep developing medicines, and starting with tegoprubart, so that at some point in the future, we may live in a time where each individual can get the kidney they need, whether it's allo or xeno, so whether it comes from another human or from an animal source, and that kidney would stay with them and function for as long as the individual lives.
Great. So one of the points you touched on was the idea of tacrolimus being something that helps the first year survival, but eventually leads to toxicity due to its impact on the kidney cells and the pancreas. So could you tell us a little bit about the clinical trials that you're running, both the 1B and the phase 2 Bestow trial, and what the endpoints are that would show the efficacy of tegoprubart?
Sure. So your question had two parts, one about tacrolimus and then about our trials. So our trials at the core are looking to replace tacrolimus. So we're looking to the patients that get transplanted, we are looking to be the cornerstone immunosuppressant that replaces tacrolimus. So our patients would be tacrolimus free. The reason is tied to this 10-year survival of kidneys that I mentioned. The reason kidneys only function about a decade after transplant is, ironically, principally because of the toxicity of tacrolimus. So the same drug that we give to protect the kidney in the early years ends up harming the kidneys over time. And by 10 years, there was a study that was presented a few years back at the American Transplant Congress that showed that by 10 years, the primary reasons why transplanted kidneys stop to function is this tacrolimus toxicity. So what is it? How does tacrolimus harm the kidney? It does it in three ways. The first is that it's nephrotoxic. It is toxic to the kidneys, and so it directly damages the kidneys. The second is that tacrolimus causes hypertension. And the third is that tacrolimus causes high blood sugar or diabetes. And it does that because it's toxic to the pancreas cells that make insulin. Now, to further the irony, 70% of people that need a kidney transplant need that transplant because of either hypertension or diabetes. That's what destroyed their kidneys to begin with. So tacrolimus, toxic to the kidneys directly, causes hypertension, which can harm the kidneys, causes high blood glucose and diabetes, which also can harm the kidneys. And as a result, over time, it damages the kidneys and they only survive about 10 years. We see this in other types of transplants, by the way. So if one looks at heart transplants, so these are people that have healthy kidneys otherwise, right? It's just their heart that's sick. After 10 years, about 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 heart transplant patients will be in end-stage kidney disease. So we'll have kidneys that require dialysis or transplant. And the reason why the heart transplants lose their kidneys is because of the tacrolimus. The same drug that we're giving to protect the heart from rejection ends up destroying the heart transplanted patient's kidneys over time. We, as a result, are looking to replace tacrolimus. In our trials, we look for an endpoint called GFR or eGFR, which stands for estimated glomerular filtration rate. And as you can hear, filtration is what the kidney does. It filters, it cleans the blood. And this is a direct measure that shows how well the kidneys are working. And it's also predictive of how long a kidney is likely to continue working. So the higher, the healthier a kidney is at a point in time, the less likely it is to fail in the near term, and the more likely it is to work for a long time. So in our trials, we are looking to show superiority to standard of care. So superiority to tacrolimus, and we're looking to show that superiority with a hard endpoint, which is eGFR.
Great. So you've got a functional endpoint that reflects the actual survival and the benefits of the drug. That's great. In terms of the phase 2 trials, how many patients are you enrolling, and how many in the 2 arms of the trial?
Sure. So we are running 2 trials in parallel looking at kidney transplantation. We have a phase 1b that is a single-arm study. And in parallel to that, we have a phase 2 trial, which is the regulatory study, if you will. That is what the regulators, such as the FDA, will be most interested in looking at. And that is controlled. So it allows us to compare 2 arms, one on standard of care versus one on tegoprubart. In both of these studies, we're going to report out eGFR, as well as, of course, safety and how well we can protect the organ from rejection, amongst other endpoints. The phase 1b and the phase 2 are run with standard of care, with the one difference being replacing tacrolimus for tegoprubart. In our phase 2, one of the arms will be on tacrolimus, the other one will be on tegoprubart. Otherwise, the 2 trials are pretty much identical, and they are using the other components are really treating the patients according to standard of care, so that we'll be able to pinpoint the specific potential benefit that tegoprubart could bring. Our phase 1b will have at least 12 patients. We've already enrolled 11 patients in that trial. Once we hit 12, we may continue the trial, we may start new cohorts, and it's this phase 1b that allows us to report data Since it's a single arm study, we can tell investors and the medical community how well these patients are doing. Our phase 2, the regulatory study, is a controlled study, so we won't know the outcome until the very end. And that has 2 arms. Each arm will have about 60 patients, so 120 patients in total. That's quite large, right? 10 times the current amount in the phase 1b. But that is powered 80. It's called 80% powered to detect about a 9% difference between the 2 arms. So it's a large group, and it's a sufficient size where we're likely to be able to see if tegoprubart is providing a benefit in terms of how well the organs function post-transplant.
And you mentioned the EGFR, and I know that in the company's slide presentation, there are some charts and some data on how EGFR is predictive of transplant failure, as well as the economic benefit and the hospitalization that goes along with EGFR and changing EGFR rates. Just discussing the market for kidney transplant. You mentioned 25,000 patients a year receive kidney transplants. There's a waiting list and another 5,000 looking for repeat transplants, and then about a year wait for other patients who are in need of donor organs to be transplanted. In terms of the cost of transplants and the use of tacrolimus, could you discuss a little bit about the market that you see for tegoprubart just in the kidney indication?
So kidney transplant is an attractive market for us because it's a large market dollar-wise. It has a high unmet medical need, but it's a limited number of patients and sites. So it's very concentrated. And as a result, it's a market that a small biotech can compete in because one doesn't need a large sales force or marketing force in order to commercialize a drug. To go through each one of those, it's a large market dollar-wise for the following reason. Today, there are, to your point, 25,000 patients that are getting transplanted in the US every year. There's another about 18, 20,000 in Europe as well. There's 10 times that many that are currently living with a kidney graft. So 250,000 Americans that have a kidney transplant. The cost is the following. They're part of end-stage kidney disease. And end-stage renal disease is special in the US in that it's covered, the federal government with Medicare guarantees coverage regardless of the patient's age. So even if somebody's 10, 20 years old, if they don't have private insurance, they can get Medicare to help pay for the care that they need for their end-stage kidney disease. And that includes dialysis, transplant, and it includes the medicines that someone needs to take for life for their transplant. In the US, last year, the Medicare spent over $50 billion on end-stage kidney disease.
Wow.
That fell in a few buckets. The cost of dialysis, which is what patients need if they don't get a transplant, is over $100,000 a year. And dialysis has poor outcomes, by the way. You know, average survival on dialysis is less than 5 years. The cost of a transplant can be over $400,000. So it is a expensive procedure. To give you a sense of the potential market for a drug like ours, if we look at tacrolimus, which is the standard of care, tacrolimus was invented in the 90s, 80s. It was invented in the 80s, approved in the 90s. And so 30 years later, in 2022, it's generic. The original company that invented it, Astellas, still did $1.5 billion in revenues in branded tacrolimus, 30 years after it was approved. In fact, the drug that was approved beforehand, that was the prior standard of care, a drug called cyclosporin, that was invented by Novartis. It was a $1 billion plus drug back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And in 2022, so 40 years after it was approved, Novartis still did $310 million in revenues for that 40-year-old drug. So this is already for not only the current standard of care, but the historical standard of care, a very large pharmaceutical market. And if we have a better drug that can show that it's superior to the standard of care, we believe that this could be a large market dollar-wise for us too. So that's the dollars. But if we look at how broad is that market? How difficult is it to find those patients and the physicians that treat them? It's in the US, as an example, it's not. There are only about 120, 150 sites that do kidney transplants in the United States. There are only 750 transplant surgeons or so in the US, and they're concentrated in those sites. So we can call on those physicians and we can reach those patients with a very small marketing team, a very small sales team. So we can do it as a small company. What you mentioned, I used to be at Sanofi, which is a 115,000 person company. One doesn't need a 115,000 person company to call on 750 doctors at 100 odd sites.
Yeah, everything you've just said, from my point of view, you have a drug that could be superior to the current standard of care, and the patients would benefit by having longer transplant duration and avoiding second transplants. So the patients do better. The cost of these repeat surgeries and all of these drugs, just if you replaced it, would be in the billions in sales. And then the cost savings for the healthcare system would also be in the billions, not only in the hospitalizations that lead to kidney failure or transplant failure, but also in the cost and the reduction, as well as the efficiency of having a better drug. So this looks like a win-win for the patients, the company, and the healthcare system.
Yeah, I can't, you're the expert at forecasting as an analyst, and I can't provide guidance on revenues. But here we are talking, to your point, about areas where there can be very significant benefits. If we can, and we'll truly be saving lives. So every organ that we can get to survive longer will free up organs that can then go to individuals that might have otherwise died because they wouldn't have gotten an organ. So by allowing organs to survive longer, we can help save lives of multiple people, right? 2 people or more at the same time.
Yeah, you're saving lives, you're improving the quality of life by improving eGFR. So this looks like a real breakthrough treatment for kidney transplantation.
We're improving the quality of life in multiple ways. And one of them is, as I mentioned, because tacrolimus has these side effects, which I mentioned, the hypertension, the diabetes. And we haven't seen either one of those to date in what we've reported. So if we're able not to have patients not get high blood pressure, not get diabetes, tacrolimus also causes a tremor and brain fog. And we have not reported those side effects with our drug in the 100+ humans that we've been in to date. If we're able to not have those side effects, then just not having high blood pressure, diabetes, tremors, and brain fog would be a benefit to patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Just shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that's been in the news recently is the idea of transplanting organs from pigs to monkeys and pig organs to humans with a successful transplantation reported in September that used tigroprobart as part of the immunosuppressive regimen. Can you tell us a little bit about the xenotransplantation? Because I know that the idea of breeding animals to harvest their organs for transplantation has been something that's been in development and was basically considered science fiction not that long ago, but was seen as something that could make more organs available for transplantation.
I agree with you. I think pretty recently the people would have said that Xeno was science fiction, but now we're doing it.
Yeah.
Now it's still being done. This is all experimental. So we're still a ways away from being able to do it in an FDA approved manner. But we are now able to perform xenotransplants into humans. We mentioned the lack of organs, and for example, the 5,000 Americans a year that die waiting for a kidney that they were unable to get. Allowing organs to survive longer, which is what we're doing with tegoprubart, is one way of solving that gap for organs. Another way is to allow animal organs to be used in humans, so xeno. The reason why in the past it had been viewed as science fiction is twofold. The first component is we didn't know how to create hearts, so animal hearts, that were humanized. So they're coming from an animal, but they've been modified to become more human-like so that the immune system does not react as robustly against the heart. The second issue had to do with the drugs that we were using to protect those organs from rejection. Since we did not have drugs that were powerful enough to stop the immune attack. So for Xeno to become successful, I believe we're going to need both better organs as well as better drugs. And that's what you saw in the transplant that was just done, where we're using next generation organs. The pig heart that came from Revivicor or United Therapeutics that was used is one that was modified to be more human-like, but it was given alongside tegoprubart, since tegoprubart can help better protect that organ than traditional immunosuppressants like tacrolimus. And this has been shown now in multiple pig to monkey experiments. In fact, we have multiple collaborations that are ongoing in Xeno. Aside from United Therapeutics and Revivicor, the other large player is eGenesis. And a few years back, we had announced a collaboration with eGenesis where they use our immunomodulators, so tegoprubart, across their organ development pipeline. And I bring up eGenesis because the other big news in the space was eGenesis's paper last week. And what that paper showed was that they were able to take kidneys from pigs and put those pig kidneys in monkeys and allow those monkeys to survive up to 2 years or more. And that's really remarkable because now we're talking about years of life. But the way they did that was by modifying the heart, as well as using an anti-CD40 ligand, so the same class of drugs that tegoprubart is in. So it was both of those modifications together that allowed the organs to do so well.
Great. And one of the other things about tegoprubart and its targeting of the CD40 ligand is that that's involved in so many immune responses that I see tegoprubart as a product with an extensive pipeline and many other indications. Can you tell us about some of the possibilities that you've been exploring?
Sure. So we are currently looking, as we mentioned, at kidney transplantation. But if we work in humans in kidney transplantation, then we would expect that we should work in other types of organ transplant. So that could be heart transplants, liver transplants, lung transplants, cellular transplants, and the like. We're currently doing work in, so obviously in heart transplants, since we're in Xeno, as we just spoke about, but we're also doing work in liver transplant. And we're doing work in non-human primates, so monkey right now, and we would expect sometime next year to make the data from that trial public. So the first way that we can expand our market is by going from kidney transplantation to other types of transplantation. And now we're talking for each one of those, thousands more of patients every year. The next place where we believe an anti-CD40 ligand can have utility is in neurodegeneration. We have historically developed tegoprubart for ALS. That we showed a very nice phase 2 data in ALS, but right now we are not yet moving that program into phase 3 because of financial reasons. As you know, it's a tough market out there in biotech, and so we are looking for ideally non-dilutive financing sources to allow us to move ALS forward. But others have shown supporting data in different neurodegenerative indications, and in particular, I'll highlight multiple sclerosis, where there's currently a lot of excitement around our mechanism. And finally, there's the potential for more traditional autoimmune indications, and these are very large population indications, things like rheumatoid arthritis or Sjogren's syndrome. There are 3 million Americans that are reported to have Sjogren's syndrome, as an example. Now, we are focused on transplant, as I said. It's an indication that we can do as a smaller company. We have some competitors in the space. Most of our competitors are large pharmaceutical companies, and they're right now not focusing on transplant. Instead, they're focusing on things like rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, these millions of people indications. And that's what they're going after. And while our drug could be used there, it's probably difficult for us to do that on our own. It'd be too hard for us to do that on our own as a small biotech. So we're happy to let other companies go and chase those very large indications, large population indications. We're going to focus on a niche, on transplant primarily, and we'll continue to look at neurodegeneration, in particular ALS, where we can do the trials and we can commercialize ourselves, but where the potential returns and the potential markets from a dollar perspective remain extremely large potentially.
Yes, the idea of focusing on kidney being a compact market where there's a small community of surgical specialists is I think a good strategy for the company to get on the market, and then once you have results, then go into other indications as well. But one of the things you mentioned was,
but sorry to interrupt you. It's still large. So 25,000 new patients every year in kidney transplant, and they're on the drug for life. So as long as their kidneys work. So if we got, let's take a number, 10,000 new patients on year 1, if we got 10,000 new patients in year 2, we'd now have 20,000 patients, because those patients from year 1 remain on drug for life. And of course, there's always the pool of patients, the 250,000 patients that are living with a transplant. They too could potentially be moved over to a new standard of care. So a very large patient population. And then in liver transplant, which we mentioned, that's 7,000 new patients a year, 10 times the 70,000 Americans living with liver transplants. And then we have heart, and then we have lung. So transplant itself can quickly become a very large population.
yes, we're talking about many billions here, just in transplant. But just one of the things you mentioned was the financial environment for biotechnology companies. Could you discuss a little bit about your cash on hand and how you're going to fund the trials that we've been discussing?
Sure. So in this difficult market, and it's been a difficult market over the past few years, we've been quite fortunate from a financing perspective. So we formed Eledon by doing what is called a reverse merger. So we took assets out of a nonprofit and merged them into a public company shell. And concurrently with that, we raised just over $116 million. So that was in September 2020. $8 million immediately before the merger and $108 million concurrently with the merger. We did our next raise in April of 2023, so earlier this year. And that was on the heels of data from our phase 1b study. And in that deal, it was structured the following way. It's a tranche deal. So there were $35 million upfront, and then there are $105 million that can be accessible to us next year, so for which we can be eligible for in 2024, depending on how well recruitment is going in our clinical trials. And there are 5-year warrants. There are long-term warrants associated with that raise. So the raise we did in April was structured as $140 million in the near term and 25% long-term warrant coverage. We finished last quarter, so the last quarter reported, so the second quarter, with just over $71 million in the bank. And taking that into account with the up to $105 million that we expect to get next year, if we were to get that capital, that would allow us to have sufficient capital to finish the trials that I spoke about. So finish get data from the phase 2 study, continue to generate data from the phase 1b study, finish the ongoing Xeno work, finish the ongoing monkey liver work. We can do all of that and more and still have multiple quarters of cash based on the financings that we've completed. Again, assuming that we can continue to enroll and then we get the remaining $105 million next year.
Yeah, that's great. They're, as you said, difficult environment, which is quite an understatement, probably one of the worst environments I can recall. And
in this environment, we're very appreciative that we've had such a supportive core group of investors that have continued to invest in the company in our rounds.
And speaking of the investors, are there any institutions or what's the level of institutional ownership at this point?
So most of our ownership is institutional. Our largest shareholder is BVF, which is a healthcare-focused fund based out of San Francisco. I would note that in our last deal, we had 2 interesting investors come in, or just say 2 specific ones of note. The first one is Sanofi. So the large pharmaceutical company came in, and that they have no rights. It was a passive investment, but having a large pharma invest obviously brings a certain level of validation to what we're doing. So we were thrilled to have them contact us and offer to join the syndicate. And we also had JDRF, which is the very large diabetes nonprofit. They have a fund, and through their fund, they invested in Eledon as well.
Great. Okay, just
again, it helps validate everything that we're doing to have one of the largest nonprofit and research organizations in the country invest in us.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. And the institutions that have made these investments are well known for their due diligence. So in terms of the coming months? You mentioned that there's a 1B trial, the open label trial that will be presenting data in November. Are there other milestones or events that we can look forward to?
So we will continue to have regular news flow. The phase 1B gives us a way to give updates on our data in a regular manner. In a few weeks, we're going to present data on our first 11 subjects in that transplant kidney study trial, and we'll do that at Kidney Week on November 2nd. That's one of the largest medical scientific conferences for kidneys in the States every year. There we'll have about one patient that will be out at a year. But what we're going to be able to do is last time we presented, we only had 3 patients worth of data. But in 6 months, we're going to be able to present as an update. And so at that point, we'll have many patients that will be at over a year. So thanks to the phase 1B, we're going to have a continuous news flow where once or twice a year, we can give an update on a continually increasing number of patients in that trial. In parallel, we're going to get data from Xenotransplantation. We hope that in the future we'll have other patients that will be able to enroll in similar studies, and they too will generate news and data. And finally, as I mentioned, we have ongoing work in liver transplant in monkey models, and that too will advance. And so in 2024, we'll be able to hopefully present data on how well that work is going. And as we spoke about earlier, that could have implications for a new market, new transplant market that we would be able to enter. And of course, pretty soon thereafter, as we get to early 2026, then we'll have the really big data, which is the data from our ongoing phase 2 study. So we expect to finish enrollment in that study late next year, which would allow us to it's a 12-month endpoint, so allow us to get the last patient out in late 2025 and to report out in 2026 what the data is and whether we were able to beat standard of care.
There's been some news recently about islet cell transplantation and the use of tegoprubart for immune suppression in that indication. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Absolutely. So as we mentioned earlier, one of the side effects of tacrolimus is that it's toxic to the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas. If you think about it, we do all sorts of transplants. We've spoken about kidney, heart, lung. We even do face transplants. But we don't really do pancreatic transplants, even though those could be potential cures for diabetes. Now, why is that? Well, it ends up that the reason is tacrolimus, that the same drug we need to protect the pancreas from rejection ends up harming those cells. And so patients that get pancreatic cell transplants often need 2, 3, or more transplants in order to become insulin-free. The concept is that by using a non-toxic agent for immunosuppression, one might be able to allow more organs to work, and so one would only need a single transplant for these patients. It's been announced publicly that Peter Witkowski at the University of Chicago is going to run an investigator-sponsored trial where he will look at doing islet cell transplantation, but instead of using a tacrolimus as his core immunosuppressant, he is going to use tegoprubart. So this is a very exciting piece of work. It would open up potentially another market, but this is work that is not being done by Eledon directly. This is really being led by Peter Witkowski at the University of Chicago. And of course, I'd like to highlight that he's able to do this because of gracious financial support that he's received from a number of nonprofits, including JDRF.
Okay, and just in summary, we've discussed some really interesting scientific concepts, some market dynamics. Are there 2 or 3 takeaway messages that you'd like to conclude with?
I think as investors walk away from our time today, perhaps I'd highlight 3 things. The first one is that we are talking about a fundamental unmet need with kidney transplantation. One where we can allow people to live longer, hopefully, as well as more organs to be available so that other people can get organs they otherwise might not have had. So this is part of a large market dollar-wise, as I mentioned, but very concentrated from what would be required in order to market in. So large market, but accessible to small company our size, and one that will have profound impact on patients. So that's the first point. The second point is around the science. Transplant is the low-hanging fruit, we believe, for tegoprubart, and there's now been ample data from non-human primate studies as well as human studies, including the studies that we're running and that we've reported about, including specifically in kidney transplantation, that supports the likelihood of tegoprubart to be able to better protect transplanted organs, transplanted kidneys, and do so in a way that is superior to the standard of care. And the third takeaway is that we are executing and that we will have a lot of news, both in the near term, medium term, and of course, the long term. And as such, I think the combination of a large market that can have deep impact on patients with good science and a steady news flow should allow us to deliver deep value to our investors.
Excellent. Well, thank you. This has been a really interesting discussion. Lots of great information and lots of interesting things about the company and the drivers ahead. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us. If there's anyone who has follow-up questions, you can contact me through the Noble Capital website or the company directly through its website. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Have a great day.
NobleCon 19 at Florida Atlantic University. Located at the center of one of South Florida's most vibrant and fastest growing cities, Boca Raton offers an unparalleled cultural, recreational, educational, and business environment, the perfect setting for NobleCon 19. Now in its 19th year, NobleCon 2023 will be our biggest ever. We're inviting more companies, larger companies, and dramatically expanding the investor representation. And with the move to the FAU College of Business Executive Education, all new, state-of-the-art 50,000 square foot facility, NobleCon is the gold standard on the conference circuit. NobleCon 19 at FAU. It's time to invest in knowledge.